everyone, welcome to our video on this week's module topic, which is memory. In this video, I'm going to provide some hopefully kind of thought-provoking examples of memory and its importance and what happens if we have certain memory deficits or not. And then I'll spend a brief amount of time covering some of the concepts, the basic concepts of the memory process. So let's get started. In this first thought experiment, I want you to think about if technology would allow, would you intentionally remove a memory, a specific memory? Many students, when I ask this question, have a very quick yes or no response. So I want you to think about your response and then think about the implications of that, right? How has that memory formed your sense of self? How has it formed your experiences? How has it formed your past and your future? And what would happen if you got rid of that? Now, in humans, this is an ability that we do not yet have, although many are arguing that we are not far from being able to do this with human memory. We have done this with mice. So what you see here on your screen is a mouse that's been involved in research at MIT, where using a laser beam, which is that light on its head, they have been able to specify neurons or cells that are involved in specific memories and hit those cells with laser beams and alter the memories so that they create false memories. They remove memories, and they have even changed the emotional tone of memories from negative to positive and vice versa. If you're interested in below this video, I will post the link to this TED Talk by the MIT researchers. It's a very humorous and obviously very fascinating example of research with memory. The next thought-provoking, or I should say thought experiment I have for you is think about what your life might look like if you could never create a new memory. So imagine you watch this video through, and after that point, you are never able to create a new memory. It's as if you would live deeply rooted to your past. You would remember everything that's happened up until that moment. And then after that, you would just be caught in this very brief loop of kind of following new information and then forgetting it and being brought right back to where you were before, having last remembered this talk. Thank goodness, aren't you the lucky one for that, right? Now, this is the case of many novels and many movies. So for instance, if you've seen Finding Nemo, Dory has this experience where she has some memories of the past, but is unable to create new memories. It's also the basis for this film, a little bit dated now, a very kind of violent film, but one that I highly recommend if you're interested in these kinds of memory deficits, but it's called Memento. This individual, Leonard, he had brain trauma and he is no longer able to create new memories. So what he does, if you see in the clips on this screen, is he tattoos information on his body to help him remember information that's important to him. He's trying to avenge the death of his wife. Now, it's also the case of real life memory deficits, real life experiences of amnesia, either acute or short term or chronic and long term. So often this is the result of brain trauma or brain damage if it's long term, but it can also be the case of seemingly no brain damage. So as what you see here in the fourth picture on your screen of the woman in the hospital bed, this is a woman who's experiencing something called transient global amnesia. This is called transient because the amnesia just kind of comes for no seemingly apparent reason and then goes just as it came on. But it's global in that it affects all memory. They are unable to create new memories. And what's very fascinating about these kinds of amnesia cases, you saw it with Dory, you can see it in Memento, but you can also see it in real life. I'll put the link below to this woman who's being recorded by her daughter in the hospital bed, is that what we know about memory is that information comes in, it's encoded, and it goes to short-term memory. And then you can imagine that there's a loading dock from short-term memory to long-term memory. And we actually know the brain structure, the hippocampus that's involved in that. And if there's anything wrong with that hippocampus, it can affect memories getting from short-term to long-term memory. Well, short-term memory lasts about 15 to 30 seconds, depending on what kind of interference you might have from the environment. So what you see with individuals with these kinds of deficits, this kind of amnesia, is that they can live in the moment for about 30 seconds, and then they have to restart the moment. It's as if they've forgotten everything that happened over the last 30 seconds, and they restart. It's as if you're pushing play, rewind, and what they're doing in that play is often the same thing that they have done the last 300 times. So how Dory often asks the same kinds of questions, has the same kind of response. This woman in this video that you'll watch who has the amnesia, she's very focused on if she's missed or forgotten her birthday. When was her birthday? What happened on her birthday? And she's trying to remember that. And they make these very interesting loops. It's almost like a real sense of self comes through. They laugh at the same things in the exact same way. They have the same intonation, and their thoughts just go round and around and around. Very, very interesting. Now, I will say that transient, just so that you know, transient global amnesia, as I mentioned, comes on often very abruptly out of nowhere and then also goes away. So most patients will regain the ability to, well, it wouldn't be transient global amnesia if they didn't regain the ability to create new memories, but they often can never regain the memory of what happened around that event. For instance, my mother was exercising. She had transient global amnesia. They took her to the hospital. Nothing seemed to be wrong biologically, sent her home. Within about 12 hours, she started to be able to create new memories, but still to this day, doesn't remember exercising that day, doesn't remember going to the hospital. She just remembers being at home, being kind of confused. So very interesting amnesia cases that tell us about memory, right, and how important it is to our lived day-to-day experience. Now let's take it a step further and imagine if you not only didn't have the ability to create new memories, but you also didn't have memory of the past. This is an example also of movies and books, but it is the example, a real life example. One of probably the most extensive cases of amnesia on record is of this man, Clive Wearing. He was an esteemed musician, composer, highly intelligent man who became ill, suffered swelling of the brain, was put in a medically induced coma, and when he came out of the coma, he had severe amnesia. The inability to create new memories and the inability to recollect anything from his past. He didn't know that he was a composer. He didn't know that he had children. He didn't know how old he was or what he looked like. And what you see in individuals who have the inability to create new memories is they describe the experience as if they're waking up, right? If you can't remember what you've done for the last 30 seconds, then it's as if you're waking up suddenly. So Clive has that experience. It's as if he's waking up, but because he has no recollection of the past, it's as if for the first time he's not just waking up, he's alive. And so because this is so momentous for him, and the only way he can really root himself in the present is to write that experience down in some kind of a diary. So what you see here underneath his image on your screen is just a small picture of his diary where he writes the time and first awake, first thought, right? I am alive. And then he looks to the entry before him, before that one. It's in his writing, but he thinks, well, that couldn't possibly be me. I don't remember that. And so he scores it or strikes it out and then writes down the time. And then this happens again, as you see, just minutes, sometimes later. This is a very, again, severe but interesting case, but what it tells us about memory. While his amnesia is very extensive, he still can remember a few things. One of the things that he remembers best is his wife. She is the only person that he remembers from his past, and he's able to hold her memory in mind. So even though she just leaves the room, she returns, and it's as if he hasn't seen her, you know, it's in his whole life. And so he's elated to see her. one thing we know about memory I'll talk about is you can be, actually, hold off, I'm going to pause on that and come back to that in a moment. He remembers how to speak, he remembers how to tie his shoe, he remembers how to play solitaire or patience. So I really strongly encourage you to check out some clips of Clive. I'll link that below and learn more about this fascinating case of amnesia. Now let's take a turn here. We've been talking about memory loss. Let's talk about the opposite. Imagine if you could not forget a memory. Some of you might be thinking straight away, wouldn't that be nice? I would be the best student ever, right? That would really be useful for a test. And certainly if that were true, if you could never forget any kind of information, that could be helpful. There are some very rare kind of incidences of that, mostly where people have really great memory for that particular type. This picture that you see here on your screen, this is a picture of a woman named Jill Price. She for a long time went just as an acronym in psychological and medical research. She has a rare condition where she remembers every autobiographical memory. This is a very specific type of memory that has to do with yourself, autobiographical. And while some of you may have been thinking right away, this would be a great thing, I would remember everything, I would do well on exams, she actually didn't do very well in school because she was often so distracted by all of her memories about herself. She describes it, I'll put the link below, you can see an interview with her, but she describes it as if she has two screens, a split screen, where on one screen she's seeing kind of life as she's living it, and on the other screen it's just a recollection, a constant wave of memories of her past. And while this is a unique form of memory, that I think there's many benefits to, she also describes it as being very difficult in that memory, forgetting things can be adaptive, right? That we don't have to relive every moment of every day, times in which we've done the wrong thing or hurt people or made the wrong choice, right? And yet she constantly lives those experiences just as strongly and as deeply as she did when they were happening initially. Okay, so hopefully these little thought experiments have suggested some things to you. First is that memories are central to our identity. They allow a kind of time travel where they root us to our past and they allow us to project ourselves into the future with goals and dreams and aspirations. Without memory, it seems we're just kind of subjected to every moment in and of itself, which can be overwhelming and kind of somewhat certainly joyous and good at times, but also perhaps hopeless, right? If you've seen Inside Out, this clip on the bottom here is from that film where you have the emotions at the center there in Command Central, and they expand out and are attached to identity islands. And each one of those islands forms a part of the little girl's identity, and the island consists of memories. And when those memories start to fade, that sense of self for the little girl also starts to deteriorate or go away. So memories are really central to our identity. They also, as any historian would argue, help us avoid mistakes from the past. Historians say we have to document things as they happen because if we don't, perhaps we are bound to make the same kinds of mistakes from the past. People have made that argument in terms of the Holocaust and the importance of the Holocaust Museum, not only to really honor the people that were, victimized in that horrific time of human history, but that we can document it so that nothing like that will ever happen again. A dated now kind of 2004 film called Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. It was a fictional film about these two characters that had this very turbulent relationship, and so the woman in the relationship has the memory wiped from her mind. The man then has it wiped from his mind as well. They discover that it really impacts their identity. And then at the end, spoiler alert, sorry, they find themselves meeting. And the question is, because they have no memory of their relationship, are they bound? Are they destined to have it again? And will it be the same, right? Or is there a chance for change? Finally, memories provide a deep meaning and richness. Certainly, they can be traumatic and painful. But again, if you've seen Inside Out, spoiler alert, sorry for all these spoilers, but Joy here in yellow has always wondered, what is the point of sadness, right? It seemed to just hurt, be about hurt. So what is the point of that? At the end, she discovers that without sadness, you can't have joy, right? That the two are necessary to be fully experienced and embraced. So the same could be argued, I would say, for memories. Okay, so hopefully I've hooked you a little bit. It's very easy to, I think, on one hand, recognize the importance of memory in our life, but we don't often rest and sit with that and think about it unless you have a memory deficit. We often take the importance of memory, I think, for granted. So I think it's fun and interesting and valuable to take some time and pause on again, the value of memory and what it offers and provides and what would happen if we had certain kinds of deficits. But let's move forward to some basic memory concepts. And I'm going to start with, of course, a little memory test, because what would a discussion about memory be if you weren't tested on it in some way? I find memory tests excruciating, so I apologize, but I'm going to do it anyway. So what I want you to do is take a part on your computer screen or a piece of paper and pen or pencil next to you. I want you to be able to type or write something down. I'm going to ask you to remember something, and I want you to be able to write it down. So pause if you need to, come back when you have those things ready. Okay, we're going to move forward, and without any discussion with anyone, without any support from the internet, I would like you to write down the names of the 7 dwarfs from the Disney movie Snow White. So put this on pause, write down the names, and then come back when you've written down as many as you can think of. If it's 0, that's okay. If it's 7, that's okay. I'm going to use this for the basis of our discussion next. Okay, go ahead and pause and write them down. All right, I'm going to continue here, and let's see how you did. Here are the 7 dwarfs. What I'd like you to do is score yourself. How many did you get right? And then were there any dwarfs that you wrote down that aren't actual Disney dwarfs? Okay. And then if you can think of the experience, were any just on the tip of your tongue, where you knew the name, you could almost feel it, it's just you needed a little push, and then once you saw this, you were like, oh, a dog, that's what it was, right? Okay, so I'm going to use this example to discuss some of the basic concepts of memory in terms of the process. Here it is. Here's how we think memory works. Now, I'll pause here and say I have written the word mind here and not brain on the screen, but this process is about the mind. And that's because how exactly memory works in terms of how it functions in the brain, how it all comes together, how information is encoded, how and where it's stored, and then how exactly it's retrieved from those places, we don't really know how that works. So we have some hypotheses, but we have some concepts of the basic structures, but for how it all works, we don't know. So that's why I use the word mind, because to me, mind is how the brain functions, right? It's kind of the bigger, more somewhat mysterious, not always mysterious, that sounds very magical, but the bigger parts, rather than just the mechanics of the brain. So here's how it works. Information is first encoded, meaning you get information from the outside world into the mind. Think about it like a computer, right? Something that you would type, you would give it a command. Then, in terms of memory, that information is encoded, processed, and stored somewhere. So this refers to retaining information or storing information over time. And then finally, the third process is that you would retrieve that information, that information that was stored would be accessed, okay? Now, obviously, not all of these things happen. Sometimes you encode and store information and never retrieve it. Right? Sometimes you might even be trying to retrieve information that you've never actually encoded. So they don't always go step 1, 2, and 3, okay? But we'll talk about it in that process. Now, it's really important to note that there are two tracks, like two railroad tracks going parallel of these processes. One track is an explicit process, meaning it's conscious. You are aware of it, you are expending effort, and you are purposely selecting your attention to encoding that information. Like studying, for instance, right? You work really hard to encode concepts. The other track is implicit or unconscious. So remember back to our discussion of unconscious processing, that we select our attention to certain things, but that our brain processes all kinds of things that we're not necessarily attending to. That's true with memory as well, that it's encoding information that we may be unconscious of. An example of this might be, have you ever found yourself singing along to a song that you don't really even remember hearing, right? Because it's been in the background perhaps while you were studying or driving, a part of your brain was processing those sounds and the words, and you were encoding it, you were storing it, and then as the song is played, it could be an unconscious retrieval process where you don't really even know you were singing it, right? Two processes here, okay? And what's interesting is they are in parallel, but they don't always work together. So for instance, Clive had lots of impairment. Clive Wearing, the one who couldn't remember new things or previous things, he had lots of impairments on explicit memory concepts, but there were some kinds of implicit learning that he could do, that kind of almost like classical conditioning. He could be conditioned. But he would not know new information that you presented him, such as who the President of the United States was, right? Okay, the last thing I want to say about this particular slide is that each one of these processes, there can be glitches. We can encode information inaccurately. It can be stored in such a way that it could be stored not like it was encoded. And then probably the more common glitch is that as you retrieve the memory, there is a glitch in that process and you retrieve it inaccurately. You retrieve it in a way in which it wasn't encoded. Okay, so all this to say, memory is not like a file drawer. Many of you may have heard that kind of analogy in the past, right? Kind of like the picture up here on the top, that you have a memory and it goes in a specific spot in your brain, like a drawer that you can pull out. Oh, here's the Disney drawer, and so I'm going to go and find the dwarfs and find it there, right? That's not how it works. In fact, it is a process. Every one of those three stages is a process that involves not just a single cell in the brain, but a vast network of neurons. So that as you're encoding something, all kinds of neurons are activated and communicating with each other, right? And then they are stored that way. And so when you retrieve that memory, you're having to activate those same neurons in those same kind of neural pathways to get at that memory. Right? This is a whole brain affair, especially depending on the type of memory it is. We can smell when we think of things, we can taste, we can hear, right? It's often emotional, and so this is a whole brain affair that all these vast networks of neurons need to be activated in order to retrieve that memory. But when you retrieve that memory, it's very possible that another memory and how it was activated might influence that memory. Right? Or it can be difficult for a particular neural pathway to activate, and so the memory that you retrieve is just a little bit, or sometimes a lot bit different. Okay, so I'm going to follow up with this in just a moment, but I want to come back to this and use our example of the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. I'm always impressed with how many dwarfs people know, because this was a movie made in 1937, I believe. So a very old movie, and yet people still know the dwarfs. If you don't know any of them, no problem, no judgment. Let's talk about that. Why might someone have had 0 dwarfs? They didn't know any of them. Well, it could be a couple of reasons. One is that they could have never encoded that information. Maybe because, in part, that it's such an old film, they never watched it, they never read it, they never really heard about it. Long gone are the Snow White displays, I think, in Disneyland, right? So you never encoded that. It's also possible that you encoded that information and it's stored somewhere in your brain, but you haven't accessed it in so long that some of those neural pathways connected to that memory have started to deteriorate. So it's as if that memory is decaying, right? We in some ways think that once memory is stored, it's there, it can be there forever. There's a debate about that. What people often say is that you can't access it, you can't retrieve it, right? Therein lies the problem. So because you haven't thought about the seven dwarfs in so long, you're trying to bring up that memory, right? But it's almost like it's too deep. You just can't reconfigure those neuronal pathways. So perhaps what happened is you just thought, well, I know that there may be emotional experiences, so I think angry was one, right? So you may have written down angry and not grumpy. Or you may have come up with something like, father, right? I think is one, because that's a Smurf. So you think of little kind of cartoon characters, and you may have come up with some false dwarfs, right? So for your assignment for this week, I'm going to ask you to think of a memory failure and come up with a hypothesis for in what part of these three processes could that failure have occurred. Was it a failure of encoding? Was it a failure of storage, or was it a failure of retrieval? These are just hypotheses. There's really no right or wrong answer, but I'm going to look for your insight and your demonstration of understanding of these processes. So I look forward to having fun with you with that. What you'll also read about this week is kind of how fragile memory can be, that it's not static, that it's constantly moving, that our brains are constantly moving, right? It's a moving target. So when you're trying to recall a memory that is somewhat static, the target is moving. So it's very easy for memories to be inaccurate, completely false and made up, right? And yet those false memories feel just as real accurate memories. And our inaccurate memories we are just as confident in them as we are with any other memory. Now, certainly I wouldn't go so far to say that all of our memories are inaccurate or completely made up. But what I hope you get a sense of at the end of this chapter is just perhaps maybe how loosely we need to hold on to these things sometimes. At least perhaps maybe when you're having that argument with your uncle about the way something happened at the last family barbecue, right? So enjoy this week's material. I hope you all have a great time with the reading and assignments. Let me know if you have questions. I look forward to reading your work. Happy learning.